Herbert Gold is a writer, the author of essays, short stories, and novels, whose articles and stories have appeared in most, if not all, of America's quality journals of opinion and fiction over the past 25 years. He first won attention in the world of books with 2 novels, published before he was 30, which critics felt held the promise of a mature writer, since made manifest in such novels as Fathers, Salt, and The Man Who Was Not With It. His most recent book, My Last 2,000 Years, is an autobiographical account of his search for his own Jewishness. It was published last year. In addition to his writing, Herbert Gold is also taught at Berkeley, Stanford, Cornell, and at Harvard. Herb, in your latest book, My Last 2,000 Years, the whole theme is a search for your Jewishness. Why was this important to you as a writer?
Well, it's simply important because that's what I am. And
but you've known that all your life.
Not really. We are, well, that's one of the things I am. It's turned out to be more important maybe than I realized it was when I was much younger. When you're very young, you have no imagination of death, no imagination of the end, and therefore probably less imagination of the beginning. And I was a lot of things. I was a young fellow from the Midwest. I was ambitious. I was trying to make money. I was trying to write books. I was trying to get girls, and I got some of those things and didn't get some of the others, and kept some and didn't keep others. But some kind of permanent connection with the world is a metaphysics.
So you really felt no permanent connection with the world, or a permanent connection with a culture you could call your own, not even with American culture?
Sure. I'm an American too, and I'm a man too, and I'm a worker of a sort also. But something to knit this together, for me, has turned out to be a historical allegiance with my ancestors. Someone asked me this question, and I said, I'm a Chinese Jew. That is, I worship my ancestors, and that's not quite true. But I feel I'm a part of a great continuum, and I treasure this, and this book is an attempt to understand it.
But it was an individual thing for you. You're saying that this is what you needed. You're not universalizing this.
Everybody needs it, and people find it in different ways. Drugs is a way of finding a connection with the great continuum. I think it's a poor way. For me, it became important at the time I wrote this book for a couple of reasons. One is that I reached a certain age. Second is that my wife, my present wife, whom I treasure, is not Jewish. My children are half Jewish. I had to think of what this was going to mean for them and to make the connection for them. So in some ways, it was explaining me to an audience which included myself, my immediate family, and then maybe the large world.
How do you propose to handle this with your own children? All of the 3 children now are very young, and you say they're half Jewish. What about their own heritage? Well, will they find it for themselves?
They have a lot of heritages. Half Jewish doesn't mean you're Jewish from the navel down or the navel up. It means you have that in the stream, and I think, to be honest, I have other things besides that in my stream also. But it's a question I haven't completely settled, because I don't have a tradition of lighting the candles on the Sabbath. I love doing it. I like watching other people doing it. I like celebrating the holidays with people who know how. I really don't know how. But
do you miss it?
Yes. I found my sense of this through his history more than through ritual. And history for me means the past of my people, Israel, and the continuing experience of being Jewish. But it's not my whole life. I know this comes through as if I'm sitting cross-legged on the floor contemplating a 6-pointed navel. It's not like that at all. Some of the time I'm sitting cross-legged on the tennis court wondering what went wrong with my forehand. But we have to have a principle of organization. I think it was Spinoza who defined God as the principle of rationality in the universe. And I name this principle being Jewish, and then I have to fill in a number of gaps, and that's what I've been doing.
When I first met you here in San Francisco, you were, as one writer has described you, almost the image of the wasp, a handsome young man, unbearded.
Well,
that image has changed quite considerably in recent years with your search for this identity.
The beard's just because I didn't shave this morning.
I doubt that.
I don't know. Well, in a way, I suppose I should be flattered by that description. As a young man, and I see myself coming, when I came to San Francisco, a little like Dick Whittington come to the city. And I was at the beginning of something I knew, the beginning of a certain kind of writing career. And I enjoyed that, and I enjoyed my experience. And I have no regrets about the style, but I think my life has changed a lot in those years. I've picked up dependence. I've picked up I'm not a loner having fun alone. Maybe it's the swinging 60s that are over.
Yeah, it may be. You, in your book, Fathers, of course, a book about your own father, which took you some years to write, I gather, and only as you matured, I suppose, and had a better perspective on your own father, were you able to write it. But your father was an immigrant at a very early age from what, Russia, was he not? He came to...
He came here he came to the United States before World War I, 1909, I think it was. And he was a child of about 12 or 13. And I tried in telling that story to show a quintessential version of what America is. Nobody came first here. Everybody came here young. Even the so-called Mayflower people came here quite recently. And he became an American, and he had American children, me and my brothers, and now his grandchildren.
He came here speaking no English.
He came speaking 2 words of English, I think. He knew one English sentence, which was, "There's gold in the streets of New York." That's how I got the name. I always used to tell people that it was an accident that my name was not Streets, because it could very well have been that, which would have changed my life.
Yes. And he grew up in the Lower East Side of New York and had to make his own way, I suppose, a very tough way, as so many immigrants did.
He fought his way from the ghetto of New York westward as far as Indianapolis, and then finally Cleveland, and learned many skills. He rolled cigars, he cleaned pipes, he carried water when he was very young, and he became quite a successful businessman. And it's a pattern that we know quite well now that's fairly familiar.
Your book opens by saying, "I was born a Jew in Lakewood, Ohio." Now this has, I suppose, a significance for you. Were you one of the few Jewish families in Lakewood, Ohio? Were you conscious of being a Jew when you were born? Or as you became conscious of being anything?
Well, it's saying that is like saying I am a pear who was born an apple, because there were none others. Maybe 1 or 2 others, but I didn't know them. But Lakewood, Ohio was Jew-free, and I didn't really know, so I had no concept of what it meant. I had nothing to compare to. We find out what we are by being in a community. There was no community of Jews there. And so as I was, in a sense, a wasp in that all my friends, all my associates, my teachers, my models, except for my parents, were kind of middle class, mostly WASP people. But nonetheless, history educated me and let me know that I was something else. And it happened all kinds of different ways.
You didn't get this from your own father?
Very little. My father was...
My
father ran away
Jew,
from being a Jew.
He did.
He did the opposite of my trip.
Which may explain why you're seeking it.
Maybe, except I think in his old age, he's still alive, although he's nearly 90. He's found his way home in some way. He ran away from being a poor Jew in the shtetl in the Ukraine. And he wanted the freedom of America. He wanted to define himself. One of his first acts, he told me, when he left home, was to tear off a medal that the wonder-working rabbi had given him to protect himself on the journey. He wanted no such protection. And in America, he saw himself as an American who had a very rigid responsibility, which was to live up to America's dream for itself, to be successful. And to some extent, he passed that on to me. But being Jewish was not an important issue for him.
Did he want you to go into business?
No, somewhat. More he wanted me to become a doctor. Every time I was the first son, you see. Every time I published a book, he'd say, "What are you going to write next?" And I'd say, "I think I'm going to medical school." And he always had a look of wild happiness on his face when I said that. The last time I said it, I was over 40, and then he laughed. He finally realized that I wasn't going to go back to medical school. But I was nearly 40 and had published, I don't know, 4 or 5 books, when he offered it once more to finance me. He said, "I'm still young, good metabolism in our family, we live a long time." He offered to send me to Western Reserve Medical School.
You worked as a youngster in his store, I gather. I don't know whether you did it willingly or not, but...
I hated it, but I did it to some extent. And I didn't so much work as hide in the I guess we can use the word, in the toilet and read books. But because my vision of life in America was not working in a grocery store, and it was part of what was bad for me about being Jewish when I was a kid, because I lived among people whose fathers were lawyers, doctors, or salesmen, which was a nice clean thing to be. Whereas my father did this crude thing, which now looks to me quite romantic, of getting up early in the morning, driving a truck to the market, loading pears and peaches and fruit, bossing, dealing with the mafia, dealing with crooked unions, dealing with straight unions, dealing with people, carrying the stuff and selling it. And at the time, I was rather ashamed of it because it wasn't white collar. But now, I realized that I got something that was exciting from it.
What?
A taste for things. I mean, he loved to feel a peach, and the fuzz on a peach excited him. He liked good food. Riding with him to the market at 3 or 4 at dawn in Cleveland, and seeing the dawn come up, and sitting on the top of the truck, was for me a marvelous experience that I don't think the insurance salesman's son had. Meeting the farmers that he dealt with, he became friendly with some of these farmers, and sometimes I would go out and spend a week or even a month in the farms around Cleveland with some of the people who supplied him with fruit. I got a taste for things that I wouldn't have gotten if I had a paperwork family.
At 17, you left high school, and instead of going to medical school or anything else, you went into what you called your wander year. You wandered for a year. What did you learn about yourself and about the world in that year of wandering?
I suppose it was the beginning of some sort of bohemian style. I was too young for college. I was out of high school. And so I decided to be a wandering criminal poet, making my way by shoplifting and begging and charm around the country. And I hitchhiked first to New York, and then it got very cold in New York if you had no money. Then down to Florida, where I worked in a gambling joint, first as a shill, and then they decided I looked too young, and so they made me a waiter. And I met the underworld, or what I thought of at 17 as the underworld, the world of carnies and circuits, and I had adventures. I met women. I didn't necessarily do anything interesting with them, but I began to imagine the possibilities.
Was this a conscious preparation for being a writer in any sense?
No. No, I don't. At the time, I didn't. At the time, what did I want to be? I wanted to tell the truth. I guess I thought I was going to be a philosopher, but I didn't know what that meant either. I did write postcards to my parents to let them know I was safe and to avoid their putting detectives on my tail to find me. I learned to swim in a key off the Florida coast. I realized that it was a big country. And I think I did, I don't remember it's being conscious, but I did imagine that writing would be a way to make all this make sense. I didn't really...
Something more than just sheer romanticism.
Well, there was a lot of pure babyish romanticism in it. I think it was very similar to what people did in the late 60s when they ran away to the Haight or the East Village, except that we didn't have drugs. I learned to drink, not a tremendous amount, but I realized that it changed my consciousness. I was writing poetry, but it was a very private experience. I didn't think of it as having any public significance at that time.
Did your interest in poetry, you finally wrote and published poetry later, but that was during the war, wasn't it?
I published poetry, wrote and thought of myself as a poet in college and right after college and during the war.
You went to college, to Columbia for a year?
I started at Columbia in '42 and then went away to the war and then came back after the war. And I published some poems, and I realized I was more of a storyteller than a poet, or somehow the realization came to me, and I made, in the mid-'50s, a solemn vow not to publish poetry anymore. I still write it, and one was published on the occasion of my birthday a few days ago. I hadn't meant it to be published, but I sent it to someone who printed it.
Why don't you want it published? Is it too personal?
I think it's important, if you're a professional writer, as I am, to keep something that's really private. Many American writers grind up their experience, grind up their lives, and make a product of them.
Have nothing left.
And they're husks, and I'm not going to name names, but there are people like that who are quite interesting writers, but who are not people anymore. It's all turned into product. And I think I have a folder, rather thick folder now, in which I write poems. And I've even told my wife where they are, if you jump at me on camera and stab me. But as long as I know they're not going to be published in my lifetime, they can be absolute truth. Maybe I could recite the last one for you.
Yes,
since it's been published anyway. My memory is not that good, but I can paraphrase it, stanza by stanza. It's a poem about turning 50, which I just did. And the first line says, now I'll never be a fireman when I grow up. And it goes on to say, more likely a school crossing guard. The third stanza is, Mommy, now I'm old enough, I promise to get out of bed and be a responsible Negro leader. And then I added a fourth stanza which says, hey, young wife, in 15 years I'll be old enough to ride the Muni for a nickel.
How do you feel about turning 50? Are you reconciled now to being a writer?
I'm reconciled to being a writer. I'm astonished that I'm 50. I'm rather pleased by it. I was in the Soviet Union a few days before my birthday, and I did want to hurry home, and I guess it was important because I wanted to be with my family when it happened. But I haven't noticed any quavers about any fears or doubts about that age. I did have them somewhat when I was a little over 40, but this second half century looks better than the first half century, so I don't see any reason to be disturbed about it.
I would judge, Herb, from your writings that was it a year you spent in Haiti as a young man on a grant, was a major event in your life?
Haiti's a part of my dream life. I think I dream about Haiti almost every night, and I spent a year and a half there, and I've been back a number of times. I go back, I still speak a bit of Creole, and I still keep some Haitian friends, and I'm bewitched. I love Haiti, the Haitian people, though it's a miserable community in many ways. It's also a magic place, and partly, a lot of traveling, if it helps us at all, helps us for purely selfish reasons. There are 4 million people who are suffering, most of them living in a state of horror. But I discovered something about myself, therefore I enjoy being there.
And what did you discover?
Well, one of the things was what we started talking about was being Jewish.
In Haiti?
There are no Jews in Haiti, there's no rabbi, there's no Jewish community, and yet many Haitians have Jewish names. And I got quite interested in that. There are Cohens, Goldenbergs, Frankels. There are names which are really Jewish, and they're possessed by these black Haitian people. And Wiener, one of my best friends, is a man named Jean Wiener. And I started to investigate how that happened. Well, what happened was that Jews travel the whole world, and some of them had leaking eyes or some physical defect. They were turned away from Devil's Island, so they went to the Caribbean. And now they have, those people have Roman Catholic and black grandchildren and great-grandchildren. But getting to know those people and tracing with them their history, I could see that they knew something, even though they went to Mass. Maybe they went both to Mass and to the voodoo ceremony, even though they still recognized that they had this history and it was significant to them. And I would say to a man, as I did to a man named Cohen, who was a black anti-Semite named Cohen, and I said to him once, how can you talk that way? You're a Jew. He said, how did you know? And then I said, well, I am too. Mm-hmm. And then we talked about what his feelings were about it. I met, as I tell in this book, I met a very old man in the town of Jacmel who had many half-black children, I think 14 or 15, still alive, was a tailor. His name was Schneider, and he was a tailor, and spoke Creole with a Yiddish accent, which was a wonderment to me. And I felt when I met him in this dusty place, I drove in with a Jeep across a dry stream bed, that I'd found a relative of a sort. And he hadn't seen a Landsman in many, many a year. He'd had several Haitian wives. Later, there was an Israeli in Port-au-Prince. I wanted him to meet this man. And we went back a few weeks later. It was a hard place to get to. There was no electricity, no roads at that time. Get going there. By the time we got there, he was dead. There's some magic for me in this continuity of history, and one of the reasons I wrote about him in this book is that although only I knew him outside Haiti, all his relatives in Russia, or wherever they might be, are gone. I wanted him to go on, as Gully Jimson said, to go on going on.
You said you've just come back from the Soviet Union. What were you doing there?
I went to do I finished a book called Swifty the Magician that'll be out in September, and I wanted to take a vacation from that. And I was originally supposed to interview Solzhenitsyn. My Russian, I should say, it's a pompous way of putting it, my translator, anyway, a friend of mine, a woman who's worked with my work in the Soviet Union, is the wife of his best friend, and he indicated that he would talk with me. Just before I went, he left, but I decided to go anyway to look into the dissenters Solzhenitsyn left behind. So I've done
Have you talked with them? Some of them?
I talked with a lot of dissenters in Leningrad, Kiev, Moscow. They're very easy to talk with now because they're so desperate that they're not afraid. When I was there 9 years ago, they were quite timid about talking with a stranger. Now they don't care. And I'd send a message saying, I'd like to see you, but I think you should know I'm followed. And the message would come back, I'm followed too, come and see me. And
what's to become of them?
That's an interesting question. I think Solzhenitsyn has done an immense amount of good. I agree with, I think it was George Kennan who wrote that his book may be the first book of the 20th century to crack a system. The Gulag Archipelago may really destroy that system because it's so complete. It's such a total description of a tyranny that I think its effect will be had even there. And of course the book has been read there. It's been passed around in Samizdat. And they know about it. And I think there's a real outrage among at least Soviet intellectuals, and I think it's an important element in their politics.
Herb, Swifty the Magician is about the 60s, you've said. What do you write about the 60s? We're not so far out of the 60s now. Can you look back with any kind of perspective upon them?
I tried to... it was a strange time. It was magic, and it was rich, and it was...
For you or for everyone?
Well, for a great many people. But this doesn't mean it wasn't a time of disasters. I mean, it's led to Watergate. It was the time of the Vietnam War. It was the time of the breakdown of a lot of hopes. It was the time of the dishonesty that was Camelot, in my view, at any rate. And that, along with the prosperity for a certain... It was swinging London all over the world. In San Francisco and in New York and Los Angeles, not just in London. And this was an obscuring of reality. I think we're faced now in the 70s with something that's really reality. But what a novel is a kind of fantasy about events. So what I did in this book is to imagine that world and to create a story that comes out of the world.
What is the essence of the reality that we're now faced with?
The pigeons have come home to roost. It's very hard to be proud to be an American. Right today, as the news comes out of Washington, it's very hard to say that America has never fought an unjust war. I mean, we could say that with some justification 10 years ago, maybe. At least if we said it, we didn't have to be stupid or dishonest. I think there was, in the late 60s, the peculiar so-called youth revolution of drugs and rock, which made people say, the youth will provide our gurus and make the new world for us. Well, we've come to our senses about that. So I think we have now to reconstruct the meaning of life and no longer out of tinsel.
How hopeful are you that we will?
Well,
do you have you've been associated with young people for so many years here in San Francisco. Do you have hope that they will reconstruct this world out of something other than tinsel?
We've gone on for a long time. If we make anything that lasts, then we're lucky. And making something that goes on for another generation is, I think, the major problem we have. I don't think we can even think 2 or 3 generations ahead anymore.
But it's going to mean some change, some considerable change in our values, I suspect.
Well, thanks to the problems of Arab oil, we're going to have to rethink plastics and fuel, aren't we? And thanks to the various bombs, we're going to have to rethink ignoring the miseries of people elsewhere in the world. Thanks to the speed of communications, we can't pretend that everything's A-OK. I don't think the kind of ignorance and the kind of hopeful ignorance that we had as recently as during the Kennedy period is possible anymore. Camelot was the last Camelot we're going to have.
That was hopeful ignorance, and now we're faced with something, I think, quite different.
Now